Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you. As suspected, I get to make another video about dumb questions, because they just will not cease. So there was one night that I was talking about a woman that went back and forth between France and New Orleans a couple of times in her life. And one of the guests at the end of the story raised her hand and was like, I'm confused. Like, you said she died in France, but she was living in New Orleans. I'm like, well, she went back and forth, like people often did back then. Honestly, some people in the 1800s were better traveled than I am. And she stared at me, eyes wide as plates, and asked, but like how? I was like, sailing? And she was like, did they go around Florida? And I'm like, yeah, that's generally how they did it. I had another night that I was talking about Marie Laveau, who, if you don't know, lived in the 1800s, and there was a girl walking by on the other side of the street who was, I mean, maybe a mixed race woman. I can't know for sure, but I can tell you she was wearing shorts, a tank top, had headphones on, and was, bobbing along. And one of my guests interrupts the middle of the story to just shout out, "Is that Marie Laveau?" No, ma'am. She's been dead for 200 years. Another person one night, this lady had a slew of dumb questions throughout the night, and she interrupted my stories to ask most of them. But at one point, she interrupted a story apropos of nothing and asked, why is New Orleans known for girls flashing their tits for beads? There are so many better things to know about New Orleans. And I'm like, it's not. There are, people know other things about New Orleans. The only way you think New Orleans is just about beads and boobs is if you watch Nothing But Girls Gone Wild videos. The same woman, maybe two stops later on, once again interrupted me to ask, why doesn't France have Mardi Gras? And again, I was like, well, it does. Carnival has existed in Europe for quite a while, and Carnival and Mardi Gras are the same thing. But then, my favorite of the evening, we get to possibly the most famous haunted house in the city, and are standing across from this multi-million dollar home, and she interrupts me to ask, who owns this house? And when I'm like, okay, he's a energy guy. He owns stock in energy companies. It's technically owned by his company, but we know it's somebody high up in the company who actually owns it. Go through the normal thing. She interrupts us like, no, I need his name. I was like, I don't feel appropriate giving his name out because he is a private citizen. And she's like, no, I need to know him. I'm like, he's not going to be a name you recognize. And she's like, no, I need to be able to look up his phone number. And I was like, why do you need his phone number? And she was like, so I can call him and set up a schedule a tour to see his house. And I'm like, he's a multi-millionaire. You're not going to be able to just call and schedule a tour of his house. And as she pressed for another few minutes saying the exact same thing before one of her friends got her to shut up. Then I have an entire slew of ones from Mardi Gras this year. We had some ridiculous questions. There was one night that we were walking by a parade, as in I was having to squeeze past the people gathering on the sidewalk watching the parade, and one of my guests comes up and asks me, so is this like every weekend in New Orleans? Is just this how it is? And I was like, no, ma'am, it's a Mardi Gras parade. And she was like, oh my God, is it Mardi Gras? But also there was one night I was explaining to my guests that we were going to, have to brush past a parade because Mardi Gras. And one of the guests raised their hand and asked, so are we going to be in the parade? To which I had to fight tooth and nail not to ask him, did you bring a float? But there was also a lot of people that asked, are we going to the parade? Which I sort of understand. If you don't think about it much, it sounds like, oh, that makes sense. We're going to go watch the parade a little bit on the tour. Ignoring the fact that the parades often take, 30, 45, an hour to go by, and the tour is 90 minutes. So you expect me to walk you over to a parade, let you sit there and watch it, and then walk you elsewhere for like 10 minutes? Yeah, that ain't going to work. But I also had a girl one night who kept repeatedly asking me, wins the Mardi Gras party. And multiple different times I explained to her, there are multiple different Mardi Gras parties. Like, are you asking about Fat Tuesday? Are you asking about a specific crew? Like, what are you asking about? And she was like, no, there are a lot of different parades, but there's only one party. And I kept telling her, no, there are multiple parties. Almost every single crew that does a parade also has a party. And on top of that, there are parties that run that do not have any association with parades. And she just would not believe me that there's not one Mardi Gras party. But later, I had a group one night ask me why they were throwing cabbages at the parade today. And I explained it's because it was the St. Patty's Day parade. And, you know, cabbages have a traditional association with Irish food. So it's sort of, you get cabbages and you take them home, and you don't actually, but you could cook cabbages for dinner. And they just were like, but I thought it was a Mardi Gras parade. And I had to explain, no, Mardi Gras been over for about 2 weeks at that point. But unrelated to Mardi Gras, I have two absolute chef's kiss perfect dumb questions. The first came right after I'd signed people in, and a group came up and asked me, so are we going to go places? Like, are we going to leave this location? And I was just like, well, yeah, it's a tour. We're walking to different locations. And they were like, yeah, but are we going to go places? And I'm just like, no shit, Sherlock. But my absolute favorite of this slew, there was a night I was telling a story about a woman who, you know, murdered a guy by hitting him in the back of the head with an axe back in the 1860s. And this girl very quietly leaned over to her friend to ask a question. But the problem is, she asked it at just the wrong moment, so that I just paused for a breath. And so every single person in that group heard her ask, did they have axes back then? So yeah, whatever question you're going to ask on your tour, trust me when I say it will probably be better than these.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to share your own experiences in the comments below.